All right, I'll get us going here. I'm just looking at my dogs because they came in my room with me, and now I just know that one of them's going to do something. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Fall Through. This is going to be a very special episode. We are joined by Kris as usual, our co-host, and myself, and we have a very special guest, Mitchell Hashimoto. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good.
Nice. For those that don't know, Mitchell was a founder. I don't know how you refer to yourself.
Yeah.
Co-founder of HashiCorp, created Vagrant, Terraform, all the good tools out there for DevOpsy folks, and recently got into creating a terminal. You may have heard of it, called Ghostty. So what exactly is Ghostty, Mitchell? What is this in your words?
I mean, in a sentence, it's a terminal emulator. So if a lot of people could end there. It's a terminal emulator. I think then the next question is, what differentiates it? And what I say is it's a terminal emulator that's focused on being cross-platform, sort of native to the platform and fast. So cross-platform, platform native, and fast. And I do disclaim that because, especially around terminal emulators, I think people like to get really pedantic about all that stuff. I'm trying not to say I'm the best in any of those three, but I'm the best when you combine all three. I provide you if all three of those things are important to you, then I don't think there's a better option that gives you all three. But if you're trying to find a terminal that's faster, you could probably find a terminal that's faster. If you want to find a terminal that's more native for one platform, then you could probably do that, and so on.
That makes sense. I was following your devlog about Ghostty before it was released publicly. I think you have that on your personal website. And that was very, very interesting to read about. And I saw like the matrix. You had a matrix of like Ghostty versus other terminals, and essentially weighing them in their different categories. And that's what convinced me to reach out in the Discord and join the beta and try
Sweet.
Ghostty. So I was very happy to do that. And there was a line, I don't remember where you put this, but there was like a line where you were like, you can cat out a binary, and Ghostty would just like emit all the symbols really quickly. And of course I went and did that because I was like, you know what, let me see if Mitchell is like lying to us right now. And no, you were not lying to us. You can really cat out a bunch of symbols, and Ghostty renders them really quickly.
Yeah, and then, I mean, it's rare. I'd say that happens rarely by accident, but like someone, it happens. Someone tweeted at me, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, being like, I just catted a binary file by accident and it didn't matter. And it's like, it shouldn't matter.
That brings up a good question real quick. If I did cat out a binary, right, and I have a bunch of symbols now printing to my terminal, some of them could probably be escape sequences or whatever.
Yeah.
Is there is there a safe way to kind of like reset that terminal session, or should I just close it and open a new one?
Yeah. There's actually three ways to do it. There's key binding that's not bound by default, so that's probably less helpful. But if you right click, you'll get a context menu, and there's a reset option on both macOS and Linux, and on both, I think, at least macOS for sure, there's a reset option in the menu as well. I don't know if it's a window or view or under what it's under, but it says reset, and that'll fix everything up for you.
Sweet. Okay. I always wondered like what the best way to do that was, and I'm sure listeners wonder as well. So
yeah. Let me see. I can't find it right now, but it exists.
It's okay. We'll get it in the show notes or something. I did want to kind of start off with, so it's been about 45 days since you released Ghostty to the public, right? So you released it, I think, the day after Christmas, 2024. Yeah. And, it's been about 45 days since then. Describe the journey, right? I want to kind of walk through the journey of the experience before the release and like after the release. How are you feeling?
Like since the 1.0 or like the beginning? Like what do we talk about here?
Let's give me the one liner of how you've been since the release, the public release.
Since the 1.0? It's been mixed emotions in the sense that like I'm super hyped by how much people are excited by it. I'm really happy to see that the private beta worked pretty well. I would give that an A minus. I mean, like there weren't any show-stopping bugs for people on that 1.0 release day. It got downloaded a lot, and it seemed to work for a lot of people. I got a lot of bug reports, but like they were all pretty either minor or sort of very specific to certain configurations, and so I think that was a huge success. And then and so those are all the positives. I mean, I think the negatives is there's a lot more eyeballs on it now, and I think me and the sort of maintainers of the project, we've been scrambling a bit to triage thousands of opened issues. Most of them are not issues, but you still have to like go through it and sort of correct them. And so we've been scrambling to triage that, and then also fix the actual things that were like, okay, this is like kind of bad. Like, yeah, it's not show stopping for everyone, but this is like show stopping. Like there's issues that are like, oh, like this, people inputting this entire language like can't use the terminal. So that's a pretty large community of people. So stuff like that we've been sort of scrambling to fix. So I would say like 45 days in, we're still we're almost now like just getting back to being able to do feature work. But I would say we've mostly been scrambling on just bug fixes and improvements around the things that people found as painful.
So you say we.
Yeah.
Most people, like, when they think of Ghostty, they think that you're the one writing it all behind the scenes, but you say we. Clearly you have a bunch of maintainers. Do you, like, divvy them up into different parts of the code base, or kind of how does that work for Ghostty?
Yeah, so I actually, like Quid said earlier when we were recording this, I formalized it yesterday, but I would say we even before yesterday because it was very informal. Thanks to the private beta, there's been active people in the community making pull requests for a long time. I mean, the private beta was almost 2 years long. And so there's people I trusted. There's people that sort of found their expertise in certain areas, like always made pull requests for Linux or fonts or rendering or what have you. And so when I say we, I'm really saying the community. I mean, if you look at both the 1 point sort of like, I think we've done like maybe 3 or 4 releases since the 1.0, like bug fix releases. If you look at each one, the number of contributors on each one is pretty massive. I think it's over 50 per release. Not saying 50 unique, like just 50 unique per release. I don't know how many for the total, but it's a lot. It's a work of a lot of people, and it's been really good that way. I mean, I think that's always a good sign. Like, I'm sure we'll get into this, but one of the risks of using sort of a new niche language is how much contribution you'll end up getting. And with Ghostty written in Zig, the fact that I've been able to get this many contributions, I think it's a really good sign for both the language as well as the project.
Oh, we're definitely going to get into the Zig stuff, and I know Kris is itching to get into the Zig stuff. I know. Yeah. Are all of us using Ghostty here? Is that the terminal that we all use daily at this point? I'm sure. I know Mitchell does. I do. Kris, are you on Ghostty at this point?
I think
I use terminal.app.
Oh, how dare you!
Yeah, I think actually a couple weeks ago, because I'd like played around with Ghostty a bit after the 1.0 came out, and then a couple weeks ago, I was like still in iTerm, and I was like, I listened to the changelog episode that you were on, Mitchell, and then I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna switch over to Ghostty. Let's see how this goes. So I've fully switched over now. It was super easy to configure. I was like, oh, this text file is super easy to write out. I just copied over most of the stuff I needed from iTerm 2. And it's been nice. Actually, interestingly, I was working in it the other day because I'm doing some web work for this podcast for some of the stuff we need to do. And so I was like switching back and forth between Ghostty and Safari. And I meant to open Safari's dev tools, but I was still in Ghostty, and Ghosty's dev tools popped open, and I was like, what is this? And at first I thought it was Neovan, but I'm like, oh no, this is Ghosty's inspector. And I'm like, this is awesome. And I'm like, yes, I'm definitely sticking with Ghostty now. This is so cool. So it was a nice little like surprise in the beginning. Like I remember you mentioning it, but I had kind of forgotten about it. So when that just popped up, I was like, oh, there's so much stuff you can look at and configure here.
It's not something you really think of in a terminal emulator. Like, oh, there's like an inspector, like a dev tools. That's not something I've seen any terminal emulator ever have. Or is Ghostty the first one to do this? Or
when I devlogged it, I thought it was. I mean, I still think it is. I just don't know. I haven't looked at every terminal, but it's the first one I've seen for sure. And when I sort of came up with the idea, actually, the original idea came from a community member being like, it'd be cool if there was like web dev tools for terminals. And I don't remember who exactly said that, but I remember I read that and I stopped everything I was working on and I was like, that's such a good idea. I'm going to do it right now. And it was pretty cool. And, yeah, I mean, I was super nerd sniped. I mean, it's like, I think a lot of people forget or choose to not believe that like the terminal is a application platform, right? Like it's a text application platform. And so like every platform out there, whether it's text application or a browser or native apps on Mac OS or Android or whatever, like you need dev tools in order to be able to to debug and sort of be productive. And I just feel like there's this missing piece. And Ghostty is the super like preview quality, like in terms of functionality and stuff. But I still think there's something really interesting there that we could keep poking at to make it more, I guess, fun and productive to build text applications.
What? Okay, Kris.
It seems like, because I remember like back in the day when like Firebug was new, and Firebug was also pretty primitive, but it definitely shifted the way that people did web dev. Like there were a lot of things that changed about how we built websites and how we built web applications. It probably was one of the reasons why bigger web applications became viable. And it feels like having the same sort of thing in the terminal is going to make terminal applications and terminal GUIs way more viable than they were before, and way more easier to debug and understand what's going on and make it more accessible to people. So I think that's also going to help shift the way that we use these text-based interfaces.
That's exactly that's exactly what I've said before. I mean, I was there as well. I was actually actively like employed as a Ruby on Rails developer when Firebug came out. And so, I remember like going into the office that I was working out of, and everyone was freaking out because this Firebug thing came out, and I installed it. And yeah, it was like instantly life-changing for my day-to-day. Like I had been working on projects, and like that day got value out of Firebug. And so, I'm hoping that, we get there with the terminal stuff too.
What sort of information are people getting from this like debug tools inspector? Because I believe most of our listeners understand when they open the inspector in their web browser that they're able to see the DOM and JavaScript code and network requests and all that stuff. What information is someone getting from the Ghostty inspector?
It's super similar. I mean, it's on one hand, in the same way you could do DOM inspection, you could do cell inspection with the terminal inspector. Like all the properties of a thing are constrained to a cell in a terminal. So you could actually you get a picker and you could click the cell, and then it'll tell you like foreground, background, whether it's a link, whether the code point that is being rendered in it, stuff like that. So that's sort of like the DOM inspector analogy there. And then the network inspector to me is kind of like the escape sequence stream that's happening. So there's another tab in there where you actually see the stream of events coming in, and most of it's text probably, because that's what if you cat something, it's all going to be text. But if you're in Vim, it's actually super interesting because most of it is not text, and so you actually get the stream of commands in the order that they're given and the parameters that were given to that command. And so if you're a text UI developer, then you could actually go through and do that. And right now, it's just sort of a read-only informative stream. My sort of vision for what the inspector could be is that you could actually like rewind back to that state. Like if you have the inspector open, you could actually step through command and like watch as the terminal changes and kind of like replay some of that. I think that would be super valuable.
That does sound pretty interesting, actually, especially if you are developing like the next Vim or some other TUI application. That sounds very useful for those developers.
There's some practical issues today, and I'm hoping we could get around that. Like for example, for Vim to render like a single line is I don't know the exact number, but it's dozens of escape sequences to render a single line. And stepping the step through, it's a little bit too granular right now, because I did actually implement this stepping thing, and I didn't ship it because I was like, okay, in its current form, it's not actually good because it's just too granular. I'm like, so like one of the ideas in my head is the ability for these programs to emit sort of like frames, so you can actually say this is just like, it's just metadata, like this is the start of a thing. Maybe you could label it, I don't know, I haven't thought that deeply about it, and this is the end of a thing, and then you could jump through frames instead. And I think that would be make it more valuable. But like there's stuff like that we need to think through, because no one's ever considered escape sequences as a debuggable thing, like in the relation to a dev tool. So it requires a little bit of rethinking there.
For our listeners, so we're saying escape sequences. So like what exactly are they, and whose responsibility is it to like emit them and handle them?
That's a really good question. I mean, this is actually why I got into terminals, because I had spent 10 years, like my adult career, working with or building command line things. And I realized that I felt like I had a good understanding of how terminals worked, but then at the same time, I felt like all the boundaries between the different pieces were very fuzzy. Like I knew that there was something called a terminal emulator. I knew that there was a shell. I knew that knew at a certain point that there was something called a PTY or a TTY. I didn't quite know the difference at the time, but I really didn't know where who did what at what time, basically. So when we talk about escape sequences, the way that a terminal is controlled, it all goes through a single pipe. We're just going to keep it simple. It's a PTY if you want to Google it, but we don't need to talk about that. It just goes through a single pipe, and it uses something called in-band signaling. And so that's sort of the idea that there's no framing of when you do like an HTTP request, it's wrapped in a sort of envelope, so to speak. So like when the beginning of the end of the messages. Terminals don't have that. Like there's no envelope. So when stuff comes in, it's assumed to just be text that's just like blasted onto your screen, unless there's a special symbol that is sort of in band that signals that there's some sort of message coming through, a control message. And the way that's historically been done is you send the escape character, and the escape character is 1B in hex, but you send the escape character, and that means the next thing coming or some sequence of the next things coming isn't text. It's meant to control something. It's meant to change the color of the pen or add an underline or make a hyperlink or something. And so they're called escape sequences because they mostly all start with escape. They don't all start with escape, but mostly. And so that's what we're talking about here.
I find those fascinating. So I'm imagining, is there some standard that Ghosty's coded against that knows how to, that looks for certain escape sequences, or is it just like an unwritten rule? Like how does that work?
So there is a standard. It's ancient and it's really not iterated on, and it only covers a very small amount of functionality that is in a modern terminal today. I don't know the exact reference number of the spec. It's an ANSI specification, but there's that. From there, it's mostly turned into sort of de facto standards. There's a certain amount of the word emulator is in terminal. What are we emulating? There's actually these like physical terminals that existed in the 80s, but there was a lot of them. But when people talk about terminal emulation, they're really talking about VT terminal emulation, which was a certain like model of terminal that existed at a certain point. Some of it standardized, some of it less standardized. It gets messy. And then since then, we've mostly been emulating other terminal emulators. So, when Kitty ships a feature, it ships a feature that didn't exist in a VT terminal, but now other terminal emulators have to support it, and so we're emulating what Kitty does. There's a really great sort of 10-year hobby project this person went through. I don't know the person's name. Their blog is, if you Google libArcan, ARCAN, you'll find this person's journey. And it's this journey of trying to understand how we could do terminals better. And he or she, I'm not sure, he or she published a sort of conclusion blog post being like, I'm done with this project, but here's what I concluded. And I loved it because at the end of it, one of the conclusions, I'll just say they came to, is that terminal emulators are emulating a completely fictional machine. We need to move past emulation, and it's holding us back because we're stuck with these nasty protocols and this nasty baggage because we're all emulating a thing that never existed in reality. And so I agree with that. I mean, I have some ideas how we can move past it, but like I think it is holding us back, but it's messy. Terminal emulators are super messy.
That reminds me a lot of, there's like so many things that are like that. Like we have like SATA, for instance, which people are like, well, what's SATA stand for? It's like, oh, the serial like ATA protocol. Like, what's ATA? Well, there was this computer that IBM made called the AT, and it did things in a certain way, and then everybody just decided to copy on that, and then we just kept copying that forever. And so there's these commands that are in this that are like, this doesn't make any sense in the modern day, but it's like, yeah, but we want backwards compatibility for like ever, and we're like obsessed with it, and it pops up literally everywhere. Yeah. It's like we got frozen in the 70s and 80s with so much of our tech, and we don't even realize it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that holds us hostage mostly when it comes to terminal emulators is SSH. Because what ends up happening is, no one wants to change SSH. Like, there's been some attempts, but everyone still uses SSH, and everything like Mosh and everything are kind of built on top of SSH, like in a way. And so it gets kind of messy, and the SSH is always there. And SSH is really like closely tied to this idea of in-band signaling and single PTYs and things like that. And so like you could build a totally different protocol that works with terminals locally and build a pretty cool experience locally, and then someone SSHs and they're like, oh, nothing works. And so that's sort of the mess that we're in right now.
Is that a goal of Ghostty to try to tackle at all? Are you trying to like get rid of this arcane stuff, or?
Yeah, it might be one of the things I try to do sooner than later. There's so many, like the framing, I talked about this framing. There's so many things that I want to do at the terminal protocol layer, and I have this internal battle of, do I actually try to introduce a new escape sequence modeled enhancement to make this better, or do I just go the other direction and say, like, if you use the escape sequences, this is what you got, it's limited in this way, you have these security vulnerabilities, this happens, or you could use the newer protocol and get rid of all of that from the get-go. I don't know. I'm like actively, like literally the past few weeks been playing around with different approaches to this problem.
That makes sense. I know a lot of people that installed Ghostty and then SSH into another machine, maybe lost some terminal features like being able to clear their terminal or whatever. And it's related to the Terminfo. Is this wrapped up in all of that too? Is this, when you mention this arcane stuff, is Terminfo in there too? Yeah,
Terminfo is I think it had its place. Look, I probably was a child when, or maybe wasn't even born when they were first sort of solving using Terminfo as a solution to the problems that existed at the time. I can't sort of, with my experience having built a terminal emulator for the past 2 years, looked through the problems, worked as hard as I could to support Terminfo properly. I really can't see it as the right solution to modern problems that exist. And not only that, there are modern solutions to this that I didn't make that are much better, that programs like NeoVim already support. So I guess let's do some background real quick, because people are probably confused on Terminfo. So Terminfo is how any program interacting with a terminal knows what the terminal could do. Does the terminal support colors? Does it support underlines? Does it support hyperlinks? Can I move the cursor up, down, et cetera, et cetera? And the way it works is there's like a file, which is a weird binary format. Doesn't matter, but it just further complicates things. There's a file that's a binary format that has to be like on your machine. And so when you SSH, when you run Ghostty locally, we kind of like magically set it up locally, so it's all there and everything works. But when you SSH to a remote machine, the remote machine doesn't have it. And so suddenly, like really old programs like Z Shell or Vim, even not NeoVim, but Vim, start thinking, oh, if I can't find the Terminfo, I'm just going to assume this is the dumbest terminal possible. And like, yeah, clear screen doesn't work, cursor up doesn't work, like things just start breaking. And there was a solution to this. There's a couple, but the really good one that was created, really good considering the circumstances, is this protocol called XT-GET-TCAP. It's kind of a mouthful, but basically, instead of opening a file to figure out your Terminfo stuff, you send an escape sequence. So you send an escape sequence and you ask the terminal, hey, do you support underlines? And it's formatted in a way that if the terminal doesn't understand XT-GET-TCAP, it's just going to throw that away and you'll never get a response. And so you're like, okay, it doesn't support underlines. Or it understands it and it'll respond in the affirmative or the negative, like yes or no. And this, since it's over the escape sequence, SSH, it works local, like it sends it back to your host machine, and Ghostty could say, yes, I support underlines, and like so on, and things happen. So NeoVim does this, so NeoVim doesn't have the Terminfo issue. But as far as I know, no shell does this, which would be really nice. And of course, the more legacy programs out there, like the standard like POSIX tooling type stuff, doesn't really use it. Even though this was made by Xterm and it was made like 15 years ago, like it's as standard as it gets nowadays, and people still don't do it.
That makes sense. I think it definitely takes time. People aren't really incentivized to do certain things like that, especially when the base case is it works now. Why change? But you saying all of this does make me like think, wow, we have a long way to go in these things, and we have a lot of cruft that we carried forward with us that we can eliminate. Yeah,
there's some sort of, we have to flip the table on this stuff, whether it's me or someone else. Like someone's got to flip the table on it, because there's too much cruft, there's too much gatekeeping, and then the gatekeeping in this case, for example, the official Terminfo database that every distro out there gets it from is controlled by like one dude, and so he's a little grumpy. A lot of respect. I mean, he's the guy who like sort of invented, maintained Xterm. Like, his achievements are definitely warrant respect. But you submit term info entries to him, and like he just modified our term info entry. He was like, "Oh, you don't support this, so I removed it, and I also renamed you from Xterm Ghostty to Ghostty," and like that breaks everything. And so we're trying to figure out what to do about that, because the next versions of Debian and Fedora and Arch and all these things are going to have like the wrong term info entry. And the reason I put those broken features in, they're no longer broken, but the reason I put them in is because it's so painful to get term infos distributed. I put in aspirational features in advance, being like, it'd be better to just get these in and on the machines, and then I think we'll ship them before it happened. And that's exactly what happened. He removed them. This is now being distributed. We implemented them in the past 2 weeks, and now all these machines, probably for the next like 5 to 10 years, are going to think we don't support this feature. And it's like, because this one dude decided he was going to do this. And so I think we just need to flip it up.
I was going to say, I got curious and I went to NCurses and I downloaded source code and I read through some of the notes for Ghostty, and it was just basically like a journal. It was like, Ghostty doesn't implement this. Ghostty does implement this, kind of implements that. And I was like, wow, this person went through all of these features. And now when you say it this way, it makes sense that you would want to aspirationally put in features in advance, because you don't want to do the whole DNS propagation dance, right? Like wait for the record to propagate sort of deal. And, wait another couple of years.
Yeah. And that's the problem. It's like, I don't know. Everyone says it. I don't know who said it first, but there's like, everything gets fixed if you can move faster. Like moving faster tends to fix everything. And this is one of those scenarios where things move so slow that things break all over the place. Like the fact that I shipped a broken term info was done on purpose because things move so slow. Like I shouldn't do that, but we should, like the core process is really broken. So how am I supposed to deal with this?
If someone's using Ghostty now and they suffer for some of this like missing term info, can they work around it right now? Are they just kind of dead in the water, or what's happening?
Yeah, you can work around it. There, we have a page where we document some commands you could run to make sure you install the term info on your machine without having to install Ghostty. Certain distros do a really good job of providing packages that only provide the term info, so you don't need to like install all of Ghostty and GTK and all this stuff. Like Arch, for example, Arch Linux just has I don't know I think it's Ghostty-terminfo, and you could just get that, and that's a great way to do it. Nix has the same thing. We're also like trying to do stuff. We actually already in Ghostty have it's default off because I think mucking around with sudo by default is a mistake. But if you turn it on, we will wrap sudo for you. So when you sudo, we install the term info for the root user. We want to do the same thing for SSH. I think it'll also be opt-in because same thing. I think mucking around with SSH by default is pretty sketch. So yeah, we're trying to do as much as possible, but it's a very frustrating thing for me. You could probably like feel it in the way I talk about it, because like all of this is kind of bullshit to work around like a completely broken system. So yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier like the shell being a little arcane, and you mentioned Z shell specifically. I take it that you're not a Z shell user.
I'm not. I'm a fish user. I think that, I've said this publicly, like it's kind of a hot take, but I mean, I really, really don't understand anyone using Bash nowadays. Bash is like a completely horrid nightmare of antiquities, and Z shell is just not much better. I'm actually kind of surprised, because I know Z shell gets a lot of hype and it feels a lot better. Yeah, Z shell is pretty kind of nasty too. A lot of stuff we got to work around in there. I think Z shell works really hard to support old systems, and that kind of holds it back. I don't think that's fundamental. It could detect newer systems. I just don't think they care that much.
Right.
Fish is pretty good. I'm obviously a fish user, so I'm biased, but I'm not a fish user because I love fish. I'm a fish user because like it worked the best.
Yeah, and, makes sense.
If something else comes along, I would switch. But yeah, I think the shell ecosystem right now is a little bit sad. I haven't really tried new that much, or like oil or any of these other ones out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Ghostty shell when?
I know. I don't think I'll ever do it, but yeah, I've talked about the limited shell thing. I've talked about is like a shell that only works for Ghostty, but as a way to be a tech demo primarily to show other shells what they could do if they supported modern features. Yeah.
That brings up a good point. And I know Kris is just itching to get to like the other things that we have to talk about. But I wanted to talk really briefly about, you say like the other things that a shell can do or the features they can do. What's kind of the line there? Like where does the shell, what are the responsibilities of the shell versus the terminal? Where's that line kind of drawn? Because most people, when they open up their terminal, they just like, they see their shell prompt and they're like, oh, I opened up a shell, and they don't know the difference. So can you like demystify that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the shell does actually a whole lot. The shell is the sort of what a terminal emulator does is when it first launches, it launches a command. That command tends to be a shell, but it could be anything, right? Like if you double click a .cmd file on Mac OS or something, it opens your terminal. That just runs whatever commands in that file, but usually it's a shell. And the shell is, obviously where you sort of trampoline off into every other command that you run. And so it's responsible for the whole prompt, your history. Like the terminal emulator has no idea what your history is, because by the time we launch the shell, all we have is that pipe I talked about earlier. We're just seeing text and colors and underlines come in and out. I'm going to hand wave a lot here, so if people really know the details, they could pick at it. But at a high level, terminals don't know when you're entering a command, running a command, finished a command. They don't know whose output belongs to what command. That's all shell stuff primarily. I'll put an asterisk there. We don't need to go into detail, but there's some details there that matter. So I think that there's a lot of burden goes onto the shell, and I think that there's a lot of improvements that can be made if a shell worked more closely with a terminal emulator in terms of human collaboration. I've never talked to any of the shell people except New Shell. A lot of the New Shell people were in the Ghostty beta. They're awesome, and they did implement a lot of things to make New Shell work better in Ghostty. But I think shells in general would be a lot better if they relayed their problems to terminal emulators and vice versa, in a more constructive way. For example, like terminals want to know when you started a command and when you ended a command, and there's like reasons we want to know that, and so. I think it was Apple of all people, but I think Apple just sort of like invented their own protocol and injected it into the built-in Bash at first, and now Z Shell on Mac, and they just kind of did it. And now that's become the de facto standard that everyone else does. Ghostty supports it, and we do the same thing. We just inject stuff into your shell startup, and like that's again like kind of a broken approach to me. Like I wish that I had a channel of some sort where I could easily be like, "Hey, fish developers, like." I would like to know where the command starts. Like, do you think, like, let's design this together. Let's make this work better rather than me just, like, hacking it through you. Stuff like that. The next version of Fish, I think 4.0 is the big one, the one with Rust in it. I think that one does it. It will be the first shell I know of that does the prompt, or the command start and end marking, like, by default, which is going to be excellent.
Why is it helpful for a terminal to know real quick? Like, if the terminal knows where the command starts and stops, what's the point?
There's a lot of features users want, which is sort of like scroll back to the last command, copy the output of the last command. Also, when we do like, if you want to do arrow keys and you want your arrow keys to actually like go through your command prompt rather than like start showing you history. Terminal people will send those feature requests to terminal emulators. We can't do that without some knowledge of the shell, and so that's kind of where it comes from. There's some other stuff as well. So for example, like this happens by default with Ghostty. If you try to close a terminal window, we'll ask for confirmation of like, are you sure you want to close it? But if we know for sure that you're at an empty prompt, we will just close it because there's nothing to save at that point.
Right.
But if it's running NeoVim or something, we want to know it. We're in a command, so we could do it.
Makes sense.
Kind of seems like the split here is analogous, or maybe almost exactly the hardware software split. I guess terminal emulators are in a way an emulation of hardware. So it's like you got the hardware and then like the OS that runs on top of the hardware. Feels like that's the kind of analogous thing to terminal emulators and shells.
Spot on. Yeah.
I want to circle back later to your experience like before and after the release and whatnot and like feedback on that. But I do want to get into some of the more technical details of Ghostty and specifically around libghostty. And I know Kris is going to light up here because he wants to talk about this a lot too. So libghostty, it's been mentioned on your devlogs and even I think on the Ghostty website. What exactly is libghostty doing for you, and like what is it?
So libghostty is like I sort of cheekily say it's the real project. Like that's actually Ghostty is libghostty. The apps that I've shipped, the macOS apps and Linux apps, are really to me sort of demos and like examples of how you could use libghostty ultimately. Today, not exactly true because I haven't shipped libghostty as like a versioned standalone release, but that's sort of like in my mind what the long-term vision is. And what libghostty is sort of like the core things that every terminal emulator in the world needs to be worried about, which is like terminal emulation, rendering, input handling, command execution to a certain extent. All of that stuff is wrapped up in a single library that exports a C API. So that makes it friendly to pretty much every language out there. And that, in my mind, will let people focus on building the app, which is also a lot of work, just building the actual user-facing stuff and not reinventing the terminal emulator each time. And so today, like Kitty, Alacrity, WesTerm, Terminal Lab, iTerm, Ghostty, Windows Terminal, all these things reinvent, like all of them maintain their own core terminal emulation stuff. And it should all behave the same. So there's no innovation happening there. There's no reason to control that piece for the most part, unless you're really trying to ship like a new escape sequence, but most don't. Like Kitty ships new escape sequences all the time, but iTerm, Alacrity, Terminal Lab, like these sorts of apps like don't care to do that. They're just trying to be compatible. And so, yeah, my thinking is just get everyone onto a reusable core and build apps around that. And this is not revolutionary. I'm not the difference with libghostty is that it's cross-platform and it's arguably higher performance, but Linux already has this. If you're a Linux only person, there's a GNOME project called VTE. I think it's a GNOME project called VTE. So libVTE, lib virtual terminal emulator. And I think there's something like 40 or 50 terminal emulators built on top of libVTE, and it's like a super successful Linux project. GNOME console's built on top of it, but all these other things that I can't pronounce any of their names because they start with PTY. Like they all build on top of it, so it's successful. But the difference I'm trying to do is the scope's a little bit bigger, performance is higher, and cross-platform.
This reminds me a lot of. Man, I'm such an analogy person. And it reminds me a lot of like browser engines, like web browser engines. We have like WebKit, and we have whatever
Gecko.
Chrome's on now, and then whatever Firefox is on. It's like, we have these little things, and you can just build a browser on top of those. It's like, you don't need to implement an HTML system and a CSS system and a JavaScript system. Like, you just get those things and use them, and that makes the process of building a browser so much easier. It's still difficult, but it's a lot easier than it would be if you had to like implement JavaScript yourself.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right. And another good example there is actually Xterm.js, because that's obviously a library and you get terminals in the browser that way. It's slightly different, but it's sort of that. But I think the difference is doing it as a C API is going to open it up to a lot more usage. And then I should say this isn't like, it's not shipped as a standalone thing, but it's also not vaporware. Like, I want to make it super clear that I'm not like talking aspirationally about something that super doesn't exist. Like the macOS app today is built this way. The macOS app is a Xcode project. The main entry point is Swift. It's a ton of Swift, and then I import a .so or it's actually a static archive .a like C API. Build it into the project that comes out of Ghostty, and I only talk to Ghostty via C API from the macOS project. So like it definitely works. It's real. Where it's not real is that I don't implement rendering for Linux yet. So libghostty doesn't do rendering on Linux.
So it sounds like libghostty is, like you said, where the core of Ghostty really is. So I imagine that's where the most difficult part of your whole journey has been. Like what has been that most difficult part of implementing this terminal emulator?
I don't think it's fair to say it's where the most difficult part of the
Okay.
journey is. I just don't want to discount how difficult it's been to build a good graphical application. There's definitely like real challenges involved in that. But I would say like that's the core of Ghostty has been where I've it's definitely where the most arcane systems are for sure. I think the most difficult part of building Ghostty has probably been input handling. I think that's the hardest part. And when I say input, I primarily mean keyboard character entry. Just dealing with keyboard layouts is one thing, but the other thing is just encoding. Like when you type a like whatever a letter A on your keyboard, it has to turn into some sort of byte representation that I send to the shell or whatever's running. Sounds really simple, but there's sort of like it's sort of the same thing. There's sort of like legacy on top of legacy of hacks and duct tape built on top of what started out as like the original specified thing that only supported ASCII, and how did we expand that to being able to know modifiers were pressed like control and stuff like that. And so dealing with that's been hard. Ghostty 1.0 ships with a pretty modern input stack, and I realized that worked in the beta probably because beta people tended to like run more advanced like terminal setups, and then when Ghostty hit the real world, a lot of people were like, "Oh, this older, this version of Z Shell doesn't work," and things like that. And it's just because it's relying on the 80s version of input encoding, and yeah, it's super messy.
Yeah, that sounds frustrating, especially for those that like have different key maps. And I thought I didn't think that was a responsibility of the terminal at first. I thought like other programs handled like the differences in key maps and mappings, but it makes sense. I guess the terminal is one of the first programs that actually sees the input and has to like forward that over to whatever is running in it. So that makes sense.
Yeah, at this point, I haven't made a decision yet, but I'm sort of leaning towards like throwing away all the modern encoding stuff, saying that Ghostty by default just does the original legacy nasty encoding with all its bugs. Like they're well documented, at least they're well understood. And being like, if you want something modern, use the Kitty keyboard protocol, which we do support. Like but it's modal. Like the other stuff was trying to be backwards compatible. Like it tried to just fix it automatically. But the Kitty keyboard protocol, you actually like the program has to be like, I would like to turn it on now, and then we like sort of switch modes. I don't know yet. Like just a really basic example that I don't think a lot of people don't realize unless you kind of use an editor in a terminal is like you can't tell the difference between a modified like control lowercase I and control uppercase I. The legacy encoding can't do that. Also, like random things like tab and escape are the same key in the legacy encoding. So if you wanted something bound to tab and escape separately, you can't. It's going to map to the same thing. So stuff like that is like really broken, and Ghostty worked around. I mean, it worked around it by implementing 20-year-old protocols, but yeah, some software that shipped like the Z Shell by default on Mac still expects the 40-year-old protocol. So yeah.
Really is just layers upon layers of just
someone
really did something sometime and now we all have to carry it forward.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's dive into Ghosty's programming language, right? So Ghostty is primarily written in Zig, right? Aside from the front end stuff that you spoke about with Swift and whatnot. And Zig is a relatively newer language with not so extensive of a standard library or community yet. And you mentioned earlier, like you're surprised that you found many maintainers, being that it's written in Zig.
Yeah.
So talk to us about Zig. I know you mentioned on the Changelog podcast that like why you chose Zig and all of that, but what is it about Zig that really made you choose it?
I've been a fan of Zig like on paper for a while, and I finally got a chance to start using it a few years ago, just like for fun. But I mean, I think the reason I've been a fan of it is because I think it's grounded in the fact that originally I'm a fan of C, and that I think that's an important starting point. I'm a fan. I enjoyed C programming. I liked some of the low level stuff. Like early on in my career, I wrote some network software in C, and I wrote some desktop libraries in C and things like that. And I liked that. But I sort of accept the foot guns that C has and the challenges outside the language. I mean, like building cross-platform software with C is messy. Header files, pros and cons, but mostly cons and things like that. And I I felt that Zig is, there's a lot of attempts at sort of the better C, and I thought Zig was sort of the best in terms of language features, but also in terms of tooling, like making the Zig build command and making compiling easier, and also like their compatibility with C. Like you could easily compile C code alongside your Zig code, and making that all just work properly. It's just a really enjoyable experience. So I thought that was a really good approach. The first thing usually people ask me is like, why not Rust? So, I'm just going to address it. I think, Rust to me is just like a wholly different language. Like, yes, you could get C compatibility, but you kind of like, it's kind of like the Go model, like you're wrapping it rather than melding it into sort of the build unit. And it's just like, yeah, it doesn't feel like C. It's a totally separate project. I don't think they're trying to do that either. I don't think they're trying to be a better C. So I'm not blaming them for it. But I was trying to look for a better C, and that's to me is Zig.
Yeah, I think it was Brian Cantrell who said it, that like Rust is super good at like the firmware level. Like that feels like where Rust does its like best things is like in this space where like it wasn't even C, it's like a lot of assembly down there and a lot of like nastiness. So I feel like that's like Rust just kind of fit in there. And I think was on our Changelog and Friends episode, you and me, Matt, we talked about how like Go is at this like cloud level where it's like the systems language of the cloud level, and I feel like Zig falls in the in between place where, as you said, like C lives right now for the most part, or I guess maybe C++ and maybe Swift to some degree. But yeah, I think the thing that, because I'm trying to learn Zig, like we've decided in our own ridiculous ambition, me, Matt, and one of our other co-hosts, Ian, have decided to build out a podcasting platform. And we have tentatively decided that the backend for that, we want to write it in Zig for
I see.
very, like, I guess, like fun reasons, and also probably some like, if we can build it in something, let's just build it in something new instead of just like, relying on Go, which is what we've all built for like a long time now. But as I started planning this out, one of the first things I ran into when I was like, okay, I'm going to build a web server, was concurrency. And like, I know how to do things in Go. Like, even if I wanted to implement my own HTTP or like TCP system inside Go, it's like I still have Go routines and all of the power of that. But with Zig, like from what I understand, there was async await, and now that has been kind of ripped out and removed for various reasons, dealing with the compiler. So now there's like nothing really there. And I know that you've been developing libxev, which is sort of like a libuv, but written in Zig. So I'd be like super interested to hear about like your journey in getting to developing that library and how you see concurrency concurrency and parallelism in Zig and programming in Zig.
Yeah, I mean, the problems I've solved with Zig haven't had the same level, I would say, of concurrency parallelism desires or challenges as perhaps, say, a web backend. For my approach, I definitely use threads heavily. It's sort of a mix between threads and event looping. But I think like if you step back, it's sort of what Zig. I think this is the exact same problem, the lack of concurrency primitives that folks bring up is the exact same as the lack of interfaces that people bring up. They're like two separate problems, but I think it's sort of the same fundamental thing, which is that Zig isn't really trying to give you any high level abstractions. When the first thing I did, I'm just going to use the interface thing because it was a lot more applicable to me. But I would say the exact same thing with concurrency is when I first came to Zig, I spent the first week of Zig watching like every talk I could find and reading every blog post I could find on how to do interfaces because I thought I really needed interfaces. I was writing Go for 10 years. I was like, interfaces are something I really need. And I started reading it, and it started out like beginning of the week. I was like, why is this so complicated and why doesn't Zig help with this? And I was kind of frustrated. And then towards the end of the week, my viewpoint shifted to, oh, there's like a cost to this stuff, and Go's hiding the cost, and C++ and Rust are hiding the cost. I know Rust will compile down to like free traits if there's like it could like bring it down to a single implementation, but I mean like it's hiding it in the compiler complexity for you there. And what Zig is basically what I concluded at the end of the week was that Zig, the language, Zig, the community, was sort of telling me, you need to do this yourself because you need to accept the cost of what's happening here. And then I ended up building something non-trivial like Ghostty, and I haven't had a single use for interfaces for the whole project, and I no longer miss them at all. And I think concurrency is kind of similar. It's like, okay, you have Go routines. How do Go routines work? It's like you need a scheduler. You need some sort of event loop mechanism that's how they're running. You need to figure out how they get interrupted. There's like all this runtime associated with it, and you're like, do I really need that at this point? Yeah, for me, I didn't need it. So for me, it worked really well to just use CPU threading for what I was doing. So every Ghostty terminal has one renderer thread, one IO thread, and one another thread. It doesn't matter, but there's 3 threads per terminal surface, and that's pretty cheap. Like even if you have 20 tabs open, which is kind of a lot, like 60 threads is not crazy for your computer to handle. So for me, that's good. For a web server, it could get a little bit tricky. You probably don't want to do thread per request, right? Like you're not going to want to do that. So yeah, you'd have to think about another thing. But I think like the fact that Zig forces you to think about that, to me, is a feature, not a bug. Like yeah.
Yeah, I think I came to the same conclusion. Because as soon as I sat down and started thinking about how does one do concurrency, I think it led me directly back into actual distributed systems thinking of like, oh, wait, like maybe what I want is actually separate processes, and all of these processes are like single-threaded event loops, and they handle a very specific number of requests that it can handle concurrently. And then if you need more, you kind of scale it out horizontally, which then also just matches scaling up beyond a single machine horizontally. So definitely, as I started thinking about it, I was like, oh, there's this whole other pattern that would actually likely in the long run make it easier to build this thing than if we were building it in Go. And then all of a sudden, once you can't fit on one box, you have to figure out, how do I get to the next box? How do I make that communication happen? How do I do all of the things I need to do? Whereas with a single-threaded program, you just got to figure that out from the beginning, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this to you, but I would also say this to anyone that's starting out, transitioning from something like Go to Zig and trying to build anything, whether it's web service or not. I think the mentality with Go is that Go is such a batteries included language, both in terms of standard lib, but also just in terms of the library ecosystem that now exists, that you sort of go into it thinking that you're sort of ready to solve the problem. With Zig, ready to solve the problem, which is like what you have at hand. With Zig, what I do, my strategy, and I recommend this to anyone, if I were writing a web service, it's probably the first thing I would do too, is I actually go into it, and for any problem that I have, I'll look for a Zig library, but the Zig libraries tend to be pretty immature right now because it's so new. The first thing I do is look for a C library that solves my problem. So if I were building a web service, the first thing I would probably do is look for a kind of minimal, like if you're trying to run like the actual HTTP server, it's probably like minimal HTTP server C library where I just have to like, it's kind of similar to Go, like define the routing and define the handlers and like have it'll probably be forced to handle the whatever concurrency mechanism it ends up using. I actually think I did this at some point for Zig, and I sort of like landed on like rediscovering an ecosystem of C-based HTTP libraries. Like I think there's a semi-commercial one out there called Mongoose. The original ZSHA project I think turned into that, and it looked pretty good as an embeddable HTTP server and stuff like that. But that's what I do. So Ghostty started that way. I used libUV at first, this C project. I still use FreeType, Harfbuzz for font rendering, stuff like that. I use something called Pixman for pixel editing, and then over time, I just sort of replaced those with Zig dependencies as either I wrote them or better ones native to Zig became available. So libuv got replaced with libxev, which I wrote. Pixman got replaced with something called Z2D, which a community member wrote, which is really good. And usually the benefit of that is you get more safety because Zig offers more runtime safety, but also you probably get better memory allocation because it controls, it works well with your allocators in Zig and things like that. So that's usually the strategy I go is C frameworks, Zig like code to slowly replacing the C over time.
Right. Yeah, I think that does align with how I was also approaching this, because I think Like back when I first started learning Go, which feels like forever ago, one of the reasons I approached Go was because I was writing a lot of PHP and Drupal, and I was like, this is complex. I don't like this. And Go was presented to me by my friend Sam Boyer as like, here's simplicity. Like, you probably will like this. And I was like, yeah, no, this is excellent. I think I'm going through like another phase of like, but I want something even more simpler. And for years now, I've been looking at C and been like, I want to do C. But then when you start looking at C, there's all of the things that you mentioned of just like warts of it and how challenging it can be to work with, even it is this like lower level, more simple thing. And I feel like that's where Zig just falls into that place of like, here's a simpler thing. Like if you want to go build the lower level stuff, which is what I'm actively interested in doing at this point. Like I'm super interested in like building out an HTTP server and trying new paradigms and new models of it and seeing what you can really do and seeing if you can push the boundaries. And it's like in Go, there's not really a lot of space for that, but it feels like in Zig or maybe even in C, there is space to do that. But it does come with, you have to build it all yourself, which I think is super fascinating.
I mean, even if people were writing C, I mean, Zig is a better tool to use alongside C, even if you don't write Zig the language. And that's also not hypothetical. Like Uber is a big financial contributor to the Zig Software Foundation, and they've blogged about this and talked about this. Where I believe it's for Go, but Uber uses Zig as their cross-compiling compiler for like C extensions that they then use within Go or something. And it's just because like Zig, in my opinion, Zig's like the best C build tool. It makes it super easy to cross compile. It makes it super easy to mix in more languages. So so the first thing I tend to do with these libraries is find these C libraries and then write a Zig build file for them. And then that makes it really easy to integrate into my native Zig projects.
Cool. You also kind of mentioned the standard library of Zig. I know Zig has a standard library, but like I guess like comparatively to Go, because Go has like this, I would say probably one of the most ridiculous standard libraries of any language out there. It does literally have like everything in it. What's been like your experience with Zig standard library? Have you found yourself using a lot of things in it, or do you mostly go, as you mentioned, look for C things first, and then if it's not there, maybe fall back onto something that's in the standard library before building it yourself? Or like, I guess, what's your experience with it?
I definitely use a lot of the standard library. I believe, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but to the best of my understanding, Zig's philosophy towards the standard library is that it's only the stuff the Zig compiler needs to build itself. It's not meant to be a batteries included language. So everything you're using in the standard library is used by the compiler. And so the win is that it's pretty production proven. It's used by the actual compiler itself. But the con is that you're not really going to get like HTTP servers in the standard library and things like that. And so that's that. I mean, I definitely use a lot of it. What I've found, which is kind of interesting, is I think due to the low level nature of Zig and the problems you're solving with Zig, I found myself starting with the standard library. Like I'll start with the built-in array list, which is sort of the vector type data structure there, or the hash maps, linked lists, things like that. And then, I don't set out to reinvent those things, but over time in Ghostty and in other projects, I found that we don't use those anymore because we found that, like, for example, for the linked lists, to save memory, we decided to go with like an intrusive variant of the linked list. So I just copied it, modified it, and used that. For a lot of things in Ghostty, we use this model where we don't, in order to save memory, instead of storing pointers everywhere, which require on a 64-bit system require 64 bits or 8 bytes, we're like, if we could limit things to smaller, we could use smaller pointer representations. And so I modified, like, we have a modified hash map, we have a modified bit set and things like that all use 16-bit 2-byte offsets, because we will limit everything to like 16 bits, and so that's copied because it doesn't make any sense for the Zig standard library to have that level of flexibility. It's just like, I think Zig's really good at demystifying things and making you realize, like, oh, a hash map's not complicated, like a vector's not complicated. It's really, really complicated to build a really good generic one, to build one that works for every possible use case and every type of user and trying to be fast in most cases and space efficient in most cases, like that's really hard. And I think that's why you look at libraries like Boost and C++ and your mind just melts because of the complexity, because it's trying to be like a drop in for anybody that could the best thing for anybody that wants to use it. If you have a very constrained domain problem, it, in my opinion, it's really simple to just build your own in those cases.
You brought up generics for a second and interfaces and other Go things that are now there, actually. And I remember in the changelog interview, you mentioned that you haven't programmed with Go since they introduced generics. Are you generally like anti-generic then? Is that like your stance on these things?
No. I mean, I use generics all the time in Zig and like generics as a concept, I'm fine with. Okay, I don't like generics in Go. I don't think they should have done it. What I'm against is, and I didn't leave Go because they introduced generics. It just sort of, the timing just sort of worked out. I was kind of like down on generics, and then it just sort of worked out. But it's not specific to Go either. I really get frustrated at this trend of I would say social feedback on programming languages where everybody looks for the same features in every programming language and kind of like shits on languages and calls them like hyperbolic statements like useless or whatever if they don't support every toy feature that every language has. Like, you don't have generics, you don't have async await, you don't have a package manager that, you know, fetches things over the network. You don't, like, every little feature comes in. And I think that one of my like strongest sort of beliefs is that constraint breeds creativity. And if you give somebody a kitchen sink of things, you're going to get stuck going in every direction and then realize you made no progress at all. Versus if someone says, you can't go here, you can't go here, like, I think you end up going in a straight line way more often than the other people. And the benefit is not just productivity. The benefit is when you go read someone else's code, there tends to be less ways to do things. And so it's easier to understand what they're doing. There's less surprises. And so I felt that the lack of generics and some of the other sort of quirks of Go is sort of what gave Go its identity. I mean, Kris mentioned simplicity, and I think that that's definitely one of the things that Go shined with was simplicity. And that simplicity definitely alienates certain use cases. It definitely alienates certain types of people, certain sort of like personalities that I'm not saying are necessarily bad. It just like they're not gonna have a good time there. And but I think that's okay, because like Go could be your tribe for that set of philosophical sort of design choices, and there's other languages for other tribes, and I think that's completely okay on both a human and a technical level. And so that's really where I get really frustrated with Go. I think Go is really rapidly, this is just an outsider point of view at this point because I haven't written Go in like 3 years, but I look at Go and Go every single release, I read the release notes, and I'm like, this is turning more and more into like a bleh language to me of like, what's the difference between this and TypeScript at this point? And like, it's all just like, you all have the same features. Like, yeah, your runtimes are different, but like, that's not interesting to me.
No, that makes sense. And I've been kind of feeling similarly about that. And I remember, I think you were on the top shelf with Primogen and TJ, where you were like, I don't think I can write Go again anymore.
Yeah.
and I felt that. I when you said that, I was like, you know what? I get where he's coming from, because it's the language, the language has evolved arguably in directions that are not really like, that don't really align with my personality anymore, right? Like, you're introducing things just for the sake of introducing things. You should kind of stay in your own lane and be your own language, not try to be the everything language. So I get what you're saying there. And it breeds the question, what do you think Go's place is today then? You know, like it was a cloud-based language, but where is it today? Like, why would someone reach for Go then?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I think it's like, it feels like if it's slowly more than ever before, it feels like it's being relegated more and more to being sort of a niche, a big niche, but a niche sort of like cloud infrastructure language. And when I say like cloud infrastructure, I really mean like infrastructure, not even like services on top of it. I feel like there was a heyday where everyone was writing web services in Go and things like that. It feels like today there's still a lot of that happening, but I feel like coming into that conversation, there's a lot more Rust, and on the non like sort of compiled language side, there's a lot more PHPs are making a lot more noise again back in the like web backend sort of world. And yeah, I just think that like Go's not special there anymore. I think what makes Go kind of special still for cloud infrastructure is that cloud infrastructure is mostly dominated by network latency and those sorts of times, and so you could accept sort of the runtime cost, which is pretty low. Goes pretty fast. The runtime cost and the simplicity and the memory bloat and things like that you get with some of Go, and you could sort of accept that because it simplifies sort of the much more challenging problem of network communication and distributed systems. And I think that is a really good fit for Go still right now. But how many people work on those problems, right? Like they're an impactful group of people, and there's companies out there, obviously, like I'm one of the companies I helped started like that make a lot of money doing that sort of stuff, but it's a niche thing. And so like for the broad community out there that's writing SaaS web services and things like that, like what's special about Go at this point? And I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think for me, what you mentioned about the kind of the Go becoming more of a bleh language, that's definitely how I've been feeling over the past probably like 6 or 7 years, since like the late 2010s. Because it's like, I think that brought me to Go was all of those constraints it had. Even some of the constraints that everybody was like flaming about, like GoPath. Like I still loved GoPath, even though people are like, but it's so challenging to like manage all of your dependencies and do all of the stuff. And it's like, yeah, I get that it's challenging, and I think vendoring helped fix that for a lot of people. But there was also
challenging. Is it challenging?
There was so much simplicity in like, yes, I can just like download to this place, and this is where the code is. And like, if I need to like go in to make a small modification at library so we can debug something, I can just do it. I don't have to go set up some complicated workspace. I don't have to
replace directives and all that. Yeah,
I don't have to do any of that. I can just go in and make the change I want, and then I can just revert it when I'm done with it. And it gave so much power to your ability to move faster. And there are so many things that I think were really good constraints of Go that over the years, as the Go team shifted in generations, just have been ripped out because people were complaining about them. I think the latest one we see is now like trying to adopt better error handling, and people being like, this question mark operator that's now trying to get added. And it's like, error handling is not a big problem. Like I don't know why people are so upset about typing if error does not equal nil. Like, I don't know
Kris,
why.
It's 3 lines, Kris.
I don't understand why
your editor can hide.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Your editor could just disappear that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's like, I think generics were the same sort of thing. I think modules, which we're about to record an episode on, the big thing that just happened with the module mirror and all of that, like, I think my issue and why I've been looking for like something else lately has been because Go has kind of attempted to shed its constraints that were the things that made me fall in love with it in the first place, that made it feel like a powerful and productive language. Now it just feels like, as you said, kind of like it's like TypeScript or like Rust or like any of these other languages. And from a distributed systems perspective too, all of those languages are kind of terrible for distributed system stuff. Like I've been really wanting to build better distributed systems. I think things are just really terrible, and there's a lot of resource waste and a lot of the bad implementations of things. And I really wanted to start writing that stuff in Go, but it doesn't feel like I can anymore. It doesn't feel like the language is giving me what I need to do that. And I feel like there's a different path that Go could have taken where it could have been the language that could have done that. We could have continued on this path of like, okay, well, let's just refine what it is that we think our vision of Go is. Like, I guess if there's a way to sum it up, it feels like the Go team itself doesn't have a vision for the language anymore, and they're just reaching out to everybody else. They're doing surveys. They're trying to collect feedback from the community to be like, what do you all want? And they're going with what all of the popular things.
I think it's a mistake. I mean, I think that if error not equal nil thing is a good example, because I think that, again, this is going to be kind of a generic statement, but I think people who make arguments based on the belief that they are in the unambiguous right, like correct side of things is an extremely damaging way to discuss anything. And I think what ends up happening is, I don't believe if error not equal nil is like, I don't think it's right, or even if it's that good. I think, again, like, I think it's a choice, and it's a choice that didn't bother me. But then I think you get a lot of noise, and it almost feels like kind of like social degrading. I can't say that word right now, but like, it feels like a lot of like noise coming from sort of social media and GitHub issues and stuff, of people saying like, this is bad. It's unarguably bad. Like, there's a good and there's a bad. It's binary. This is bad. And if anybody I found, this is a very generic statement, but like, anybody I found who argues from a point of immobility, a point of like, this is my stance and it cannot move, it's a non-productive argument, and it leads to least common denominator kind of solutions. And this feels like one of those places where the people that are sort of making the if error not equal nil is just bad are sort of winning. It feels like the same thing as like no generics makes useless language. Like that is my stance and there's no moving. Like they are one, I guess. That's just what it feels like to me. I don't know if like I said, I haven't read the issues. I don't know the internal politics, but and again, this isn't specific to Go. I see this in other language ecosystems. I see this not in tech, but like I just see this sort of behavior, and I just think that there's value in being able to say that we have this belief and it's not hurting anyone. This isn't a belief that's actually harming people. This is just like an opinion, and if you don't like it, then go use something else. And then too many people are afraid of that. And I don't know if it's like because Go is sort of backed by Google and there's an interest in self-preservation and growth and impact and control or anything like that, like at play here. But I think there's a certain power in being able to be like, we don't need to take over the world. We just need we need our group, our tribe to understand our value and to build good stuff from that.
Totally.
Yeah. It does feel like the up and to the right desire for we want more people to be writing Go. Yeah. Like the Go is successful if more people year over year are writing it, or if it's ranking higher in the rankings of languages and all of that.
It's the Wall Street model.
Yeah, and
it is. It's more.
Yeah, it's trying to compare things that are uncomparable. Like, we shouldn't want to have languages that you can even compare to each other. Like, what is the use of that? I think at the end of the day, like, why have 10 languages that all do the same thing? Why not have like 2 or 3 languages that do this one thing and 2 or 3 languages that do this other thing, and you just use whichever language makes sense to use in that context? It's frustrating, I guess, in a way that everybody just kind of tries to put everything into every language.
Yeah, I don't think the average person chooses the correct tool for the job. They just choose whatever tool they're most familiar with and see every problem as the proverbial nail, and they have the hammer. I think that's kind of the culture we have today. And languages bend to that culture a little bit by saying, oh, we'll be a hammer too, just like you wanted, right? You wanted a hammer? I'll be the hammer for you too. And I think that's a net negative for the industry personally.
Yeah.
I want to jump back to your experience around the release of Ghostty, because we were just talking about feedback and opinions of people and whatnot, and you've been getting a lot of them, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. You've been getting opinions from, oh, Mitchell H is so smart, why is he building just a terminal? And for those listening, there's so much that goes into the terminal, right? There's so much there. And you've also been getting things like, it's not native on Linux, and please give me my Control F feature. How do you deal with all of this? Because that sounds exhausting, right? I've been reading Twitter posts or whatever social media posts and reading some of the discussions on GitHub, and like I get a little angry for you sometimes. So how do you deal with all of that?
Well, I think you just described 2 very different types of people, but they are 2 very frustrated kinds of people. I mean, the easy one is the sort of feature requests, like why doesn't Ghostty do this, or why is Ghostty bad at this, or whatever that kind of is. There's a certain level of like, at the end of the day, Ghostty is sort of my fun terminal project, and if I don't want to build something in it, then I'm not gonna. But it's also open source, so you metaphor, generic you can do it, and so that's one aspect of it. The other is like I read it and I listen and I think, I do think about like, is that generally useful? Is that interesting? The reason there's no command F, the reason there's scroll bars is probably mostly reflected in the fact that those aren't things that I use in a terminal. I'm sure if they were, I would have built them a long time ago. There are things, though, that I recognize are very, very important for a lot of people. So they're things that I've committed and already accepted to improving the Ghostty project with, even though I don't use them. But yeah, that's sort of the two angles, or three, I guess I take it. One is like, I don't use it, so it's not a priority for me. The second is, but it's clearly important enough that I will accept it for people. And the third is that otherwise, just use another terminal emulator, and that's like totally okay with me. I think there's a lot of people that think like, I feel like I've read at least maybe like once every other week. I feel like I read people that feel like they like got me. They're like, oh, gotcha, because I'm like, I'm switching to iTerm because of this. And then I'm like, I don't care, man. Okay. Like, great. Like this isn't a
I'm eating eggs for breakfast too. Like, who cares? Yeah.
Like this isn't a venture-backed product. My livelihood isn't tied to it. Like I don't need anybody to use this project. Like it's if you should use what you want to use. I'm trying to build a terminal that I think that I really want, but I think other people really want too. But everything's a trade-off, and if it doesn't solve your trade-offs, then using something else is absolutely the right decision, and it's not going to hurt my feelings for it. So I think that's like one kind of person. And then I think the other kind of person is sort of what you said. It's like, why are you choosing to work on a terminal emulator? And that's frustrating for a different reason, which is sort of like, I think it kind of relates back to this idea that you should be doing more, like you did this HashiCorp thing. There's a waste of time to do this. And my perspective on that is that no one is obligated to produce value of any kind, in my opinion. We're just obligated to be happy. So, do what you want to be happy. I don't need anyone to provide for I don't know, some vague notion of impact. And then the second thing that's kind of frustrating is like, I feel like HashiCorp and the work I did while I was there was pretty impactful. And like, if I can't like take a break after that and do something that is arguably, I think it's pretty impactful. I think terminals are used by everyone, so I think terminals are super impactful. But if you don't think it's impactful, and then like I can't just like decide to take a few years and just like hack on whatever, like then why are you attacking me for it? Like I don't know. Those are the two sort of angles I have to that sort of feedback.
Yeah, it kind of feels like people are like falling into that fallacy of like, well, you did one great thing, so clearly you're the person that's got to do all the great things, or like you're in that class of people that does great things. It's like, now everybody can do great things. You don't
everyone can do it. Yeah.
have to keep doing things over if you don't want to. It's like, I think making HashiCorp in general has like had such a huge, profound impact on the industry that like you could just do nothing for the rest of your life, and like that wouldn't make you any less of like a notable person in history. So it's like,
but I think that even if I didn't have HashiCorp, like I don't have the belief that anybody has to do anything.
Yeah.
Like I think, again, we're getting really philosophical here, but like my general belief is like, don't harm people, and other than that, like pursue happiness while you're able to live, right? Like, yeah, you need to support yourself, you need to support a family perhaps, and like things like that. Like there's again constraints. There's constraints there that are going to breed some level of creativity, but for the most part, yeah, like don't be a dick, don't hurt people, and go have fun. Like that's sort of my basic life mantra. And so yeah, I did HashiCorp. I feel like to a certain extent I do feel entitled to say like I don't need to do another thing. But at the same time, you don't need that to feel that entitlement.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you said, like Ghostty is another big thing. It's interesting how people are like, yeah, no, we wanted something bigger, but it's like, no, like terminals have sucked for a long time. We're all stuck in them like all day long as software people. Like,
it's interesting. You also get this on the non-technical side. There's like I guess you see it a lot on Twitter. Luckily, I'm not part of that Twitter at all, but I get this more from like VCs and more the financial side of things, which is like, oh, you had one big like financial success, like you need to turn that into more. Like, what's your next big thing, and how are you going to
Wall Street mentality? Yeah,
totally Wall Street mentality.
Yeah,
and I think it drives a lot of people, the certain type of people. It drives a lot of people crazy. That I have actually said this before. It's like, I think it's success to me if my bank account for the rest of my life goes down. That is success for me. Like I am like, it's going to charity, or I'm converting that into happiness or something. Like going up is a waste. Like there's no reason for that to go up anymore. Like let's just burn it down and make other people happy, make me happy. Like that's what
Right.
it should be. Like I hate the mentality of like, let's just do more for more's sake. If you incidentally get more, like if you, by chasing happiness, yeah, you do, like some people, their passion is like building commercial businesses, and that's fantastic for them. Like if that turns into more commercial success, like that's just a side effect of them chasing happiness, and that's fine. But yeah, I like there's a lot of feedback out there that I feel like chase it as like again, this like a mobile fundamental like correct thing to do is like you should always be like chasing more, and that's really frustrating to me.
Agreed. Yeah, I think I agree with your point on that. Like, you should be using the money you've built up to have a happy life, spend time with your family, do the things that make you happy, and help others. And you are checking all of those boxes, right? You have your family, you're donating back to the Zig Foundation, you're doing what you can do. And it's almost as if some of these people that are giving the negative feedback, like, are coming from a position where, oh, Mitchell made his millions of dollars and he just like left and pieced out. It's like, no, he's an engineer through and through. He's still chilling. He's hacking on Ghostty and donating to Zig, and he's doing his thing. Like,
yeah,
what are you doing? That's really the question is, what are you actually doing? But
yeah.
Well, anything you want to tell our listeners about Zig or Ghostty while you have them on?
I think Zig's interesting. I think, give it a shot, things like that. I think on the Ghostty side, I think that it's a totally unencumbered open source project. There's a lot of facets to it. I think we just moved to like an official subsystem maintainer model, and the fun part about that is I don't think I've ever personally worked on a project that has had such a diverse set of problems with clear boundaries. Like the fact that we could have a team of maintainers that's focused on Mac OS GUI development, and then a team that's focused on font rendering, and then a team that's focused on like Linux internals and things like that. Like all these things, there's such clear boundaries. I think one thing that's really cool that I would tell people is if you're trying to learn something, it's a fun project to play around with, and I could certainly use the help, and I appreciate the help. So that's something I've been telling people, because I think a lot of people think, oh, I gotta know Zig, or I gotta know like terminal emulation, or like I have to be an expert in GPUs because it's GPU rendered. And it's like you could do a lot. You could have a huge impact without understanding a single bit of any of that stuff. It's pretty all well isolated. So just inviting you to the community, I guess.
Awesome. And you have the Discord and the GitHub, and I think running Ghostty, actually, it does feel like a good project to get involved with, because it's totally local, right? You can run it, use it all locally. It's not like you have to spin up cloud services or whatever to use it like other projects. So it feels like the barrier to entry is lower in that regard, which is really nice.
For sure.
All right, let's.
That inspired a question I have about the maintainership of it and the subsystem models. Like Linux also has like a subsystem model that uses for all the different teams. How are you finding using GitHub for what is, I guess, sort of becoming a larger project? Because I know a lot of older projects use just mailing lists and sending Git patches around and that sort of thing. Have you found GitHub to be sufficient in that? Are there things that you would want to shift or change? Do you think you might wind up with more of a mailing list style development as a team split up, or multiple GitHub repos, or like what do you see as far as like the development and maintenance of Ghostty into the future?
Quite frankly, I'm kind of mad at GitHub.
The large sigh was so good. I just wanted to point that out.
If you want to hear what the explanation behind that large sigh was and Mitchell's view of AI, then you should head on over to fallthrough.fm/subscribe, where you can get the subscriber exclusive bonus content where he gets into all of that. But for now, let's hop on over to Unpopular Opinions.
All right, Mitchell, do you have an unpopular opinion?
An unpopular?
Perchance.
I think I gave a handful of unpopular opinions.
You did give a handful.
So yeah, I think I've already solved that for you.
It's true. You did give actually a good amount of them.
Do you have?
I have a lot more. I think there are opinions I've held for a long time, and I've just I'm a lot more vocal about them now. I used to have to be, real careful because, as somebody who is sort of like selling software to a variety of companies, like I didn't want anyone to be pissed at my points of view. And these are not like social points of views. These are just like technical things. And like I didn't want anyone to be pissed about it. And so I kind of like kept my cards close to my chest. But now I'm sort of like in the phase where I'm like, I just want people to know who like, it's sort of the tribe thing. Like I just want people to know what I really think about these things, and if you like it, then great. If you don't like it, then just like don't listen to me, and it's totally fine. So yeah,
that's fair.
I feel like that in and of itself is an unpopular opinion. So there.
I agree. Maybe if you don't like it, just do your own thing.
yeah. You don't have to please everyone. It's true.
That's a good unpopular opinion.
Chris, do you have one for our ending segment?
You do one, and I'll think of one while you're doing
I have one, and it's relevant to Mitchell and Ghostty and all of that stuff, based on like how terminals work. So I am of the opinion that we should eliminate lowercase and uppercase and just have a single case for all text. I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm done. I don't want to deal with lower uppercase, this and that. Just one case for everything, and every problem solved. Goodbye. The puzzled look on both your faces is like, okay, wait.
I'm thinking about it. I've had to deal with a lot of garbage, Unicode, and all that kind of stuff, and I'm like wondering if that would help me at all.
I mean, the concept of case too. Like, I feel like there's probably some non-Latin like alphabets that don't have case, or like the concept of case is very different from like the like how Latin case exists.
I read and write Japanese, and there's no such thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, I don't want to answer this question now, but where did case come from and why is it a thing? I have to go research that after this podcast.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, if I were to gander a guess, an etymological guess, like before we had printing presses, English didn't have any spaces. So all of the words were just squashed together. And I feel like capitalization could help with some of that, but...
I gotta look this up. I don't believe any of you. I don't know.
It's a thing that I saw once, and I was like,
I reject all of this.
What? We didn't have spaces? That's ridiculous.
I think we would. I think I would. If I were to change language, I would prefer to just get rid of all like gendered pronouns and stuff like that, because like the way I use pronouns, the way I use language, like I really don't care. Like I don't mean anything by any of what I'm saying, and so like if I could just say what I want, then it would be a lot easier. Like I worry about making people feel a certain way, and so if I could just say the right thing by default, that would be great. Yeah,
I feel like there's some of that in like Japanese. So I've like been attempting to learn Japanese for a while now. I have a very ridiculous Duolingo streak that I refuse to give up on, even though I frustratingly have a lot of trouble sticking with languages, because I think I started with like French and I was like, and then I was like, oh, I'll relearn German, but then German word ordering is very different from English word ordering. So I was like, this is frustrating. I think I just need to learn a language that has a completely different character set. So it's like Japanese, which has actually helped me learn proper word ordering for languages that have that type of word ordering that like German and Japanese have and other things. But yeah, so now I have like let me see. I did Duolingo today. So my streak is, guess how long my streak is. I want to see, what are your guesses? What are your guesses?
726.
726 for, okay. I'm going to say, you said ridiculously long.
You said ridiculous.
1100.
I'll give you each one more guess.
Are we higher or lower?
You are lower.
We're lower, both of us?
You're too low, yeah.
What? It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous.
That is ridiculous.
That is ridiculous. Like, okay, so I'm gonna. When did Duolingo come out? Let's go with like 1650.
Matt?
I'm gonna go with 2065.
Your first digit isn't even correct. It is focus. 3,166 days as of today.
Okay, that's more ridiculous than I thought.
That's so I'm so impressed right now.
That's just under just under 10 years or whatever.
Okay,
I think it's like 9 years. Yeah.
You were almost doing this when we met at GopherCon in 2014. Almost.
Yes. the thing is, back when so if they had streak freezes when I first started my first long streak, it would probably be closer to like 3,500 or 3,600 because I had like a good like 400-day streak, and then I missed a day and it reset, and then I stopped doing it for a year because of that.
You were mad, yeah.
And yeah, I think like even with like streak freezes, I do not use many of them. Like like in the past many years, I've had to use like one or two maybe.
I didn't
like
even
I'm
know that
very
was a
good
thing.
at ensuring and doing it every day.
Amazing.
So I'm real good at maintaining streaks. So
That's awesome.
But like learning a language is very difficult, especially if you don't fully immerse yourself into it. So it's hard.
Yeah. Any unpopular opinion from you, Kris, before we end out?
Yes. Let me conjure an unpopular opinion. I have so many unpopular opinions. There was some unpopular thing I was thinking about the other day, and now I gotta re-grasp it. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is too spicy for the podcast.
No, we're good. We're chilling.
This is the political one. But I really think that Americans need to understand how their government works. And I think that goes for like everybody. And I don't think that seems like an unpopular opinion until you realize what that actually means about having to like dig into our own painful history and recognize what we have done as a country and how that maps into what's happening now. So I think like on the one hand, it feels like right now things are very scary for a lot of people. And I think right now, no matter what side you're on, I think there's been a period of scariness for you in an human empathetic way. And I think that no matter what side of that you fall on, if you actually learn and know the history of the country, it's like, this is how things have been forever. And it's good that we want to change that. I think we're on the precipice of being able to change that. But I guess maybe the better unpopular opinion is I don't think our country is falling apart. I think our country is still very strong and still very resilient. We're just starting to see some cracks that can be repaired. So like, don't give up. We can fix things.
Like I never ever talk about politics on any of these things because I think I have a lot of unpopular opinions, but I think usually people take that as to be like, they go immediately to like, oh, you won't talk about them, so you must be like, they bring up some. Yeah,
you're a jerk.
They're gonna call me something like, oh, it's because you have the bad opinions, whatever that might mean, or something. And I'm always like, no, like, I have a lot of diverse opinions about things, but like, it's just like not fun to talk about. So I don't bring them up. But I mean, I think it's like undeniable that at a basic level, like understanding what's going on, it would be helpful to people. Yeah. I mean, I always like, I don't feel like I know what's going on sometimes. And luckily I have a handful of friends who like are political scientists, and I usually just like academics, and I just text them and I'm like, is this good? Is this bad? Is this like, is the Republic over? Like, what's happening right now?
Right.
And I don't want to get into any details. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I would just say like their responses have been very reassuring to me. I've been like, okay.
Yeah. Like one of my best friends he's like a software engineer, but he studied religion in college. So he's looked at a lot of history and looked at a lot of, because religion used to be like systems of government effectively. So looked at a lot of this stuff, and he's a smart guy. He digs into a lot of it, and we have these very deep conversations about these things. It's been really reassuring for even me, where I'm like, I know a lot, but every time I talk to him, I'm just like, yeah, it's not as dire as I think we sometimes make it out to be, and it's not as unfixable as I think sometimes people make it out to be. These are all very fixable problems. We just have to actually go and fix them. And I think that it's not just about politics either. I think it's about our industry as well. Like a bunch of what we talked about is like, we have this really old stuff that is like not really serving anybody at this point, but we don't really know how to push ourselves forward through it. So the difficulties in figuring out how to push ourselves forward and not just giving in and giving up.
Agreed. Well, I think that's a good place to end. The future is bright, but it requires all of us to move forward and fix it together.
So you gotta like,
same.
I can't wake up and not feel optimistic about the future. Like, it's not life's, I want to be optimistic. So no matter how bad things get, that's got to keep your head up.
Life has never been easy. So if you understand that, I think everything gets a bit brighter.
Agreed. Well, Mitchell, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. And can you let the viewers know or listeners know where they can find you if they want to learn more about you?
Sure. The easiest place is mitchellh.com. That has in the footer, that has all the links to everything else. So that's where you can find everything, including Ghostty stuff. You'll find it all there.
Perfect. All right. With that, thank you all for listening to Fall Through.
See ya.